The transport vessel shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere of the colony world designated as Haven 7, and the crew inside barely noticed the turbulence anymore after 3 months of constant travel through unstable space sectors. But today was different, because today they would finally rid themselves of the burden that had been weighing them down since the incident at the medical station on Proxima 4, where everything had gone wrong. In the cargo bay, a figure lay motionless on a cold, metal platform surrounded by medical equipment that blinked with warnings and error messages that no one bothered to read anymore, because the consensus had been reached weeks ago that she was beyond saving and resources could not be wasted on. A lost cause when the rest of the crew needed those supplies to survive the journey home to their own world. Her name was Zara, and she belonged to a species called the Valerian people, who were known across the galaxy for their striking appearance, with skin that shimmered in shades of deep blue and violet eyes that held the depth of nebulas and hair that moved like liquid silver, even when there was no breeze to stir it. But none of that mattered now, because she was dying, and her own people had decided she was not worth the effort to save. The captain of the vessel, a stern woman named Commander Vrex, stood at the observation window looking down at the planet below, with cold calculation in her eyes as she spoke to her second-in-command about the disposal protocol they would follow once they reached the surface, because leaving Zara here would solve multiple problems at once, including the drain on medical supplies and the uncomfortable questions that might arise if they returned home with a crew member who had contracted an unknown illness during an unauthorized expedition. Below them, Haven 7 was a world that had been colonized by humans decades ago as part of their expansion into the outer territories, and it had grown into a modest settlement with farms and small towns scattered across the temperate zones where the climate was suitable for earth crops and livestock, though the population remained relatively small compared to the core worlds, because most people preferred the comfort and security of established planets rather than the isolation of frontier life. The decision had been made without consulting Zara, because she had been unconscious for 2 weeks since the fever had taken hold of her body and ravaged her system with a disease that their medical scanners could not identify or treat effectively, despite trying every known Valerian remedy and several experimental treatments that had only seemed to make her condition worse, until the medical officer had declared that continuing treatment would be futile and possibly dangerous to the rest of the crew. No one had objected to the plan except for one young engineer who had suggested they at least try to contact the human settlement for help. But she had been quickly silenced by the others, who reminded her that interspecies medical knowledge was limited, and humans would likely be just as helpless as they were in the face of this mysterious illness that had already claimed 2 other crew members before Zara had fallen ill, though those deaths had been attributed to different causes at the time. The transport descended through layers of clouds that were tinged pink by the setting sun, and the landing thrusters engaged with a roar that echoed across the quiet landscape as the vessel settled onto a flat stretch of grassland several kilometers from the nearest human town, where they hoped no one would notice their brief presence, because official first contact protocols required extensive documentation and approval from both governments before any interaction could take place. Commander Vrex personally oversaw the removal of Zara from the medical bay, and her unconscious form was carried to the cargo ramp by 2 crew members who handled her with mechanical efficiency, showing no emotion as they laid her on the ground beside a small container of water and a thermal blanket that would provide minimal protection from the elements, but would ease their consciences slightly when they reported the incident to their superiors. The captain looked down at Zara one final time and felt a brief flicker of something that might have been regret, but she pushed it aside because command decisions required pragmatism. Over sentiment and saving one life at the cost of many was not a trade she was willing to make, even if that one life had once been a promising young scientist who had contributed valuable research to their understanding of xenobiology before this disaster had struck. Within minutes, the transport lifted off again, leaving behind only scorched grass and a dying alien woman who had been abandoned by her own kind because they deemed her too sick to save and too expensive to maintain when resources were scarce, and the journey home was still long and treacherous through sectors where pirates and hostile species made every day a gamble with death. Zara remained unconscious through all of this, unaware that she had been left alone on a foreign world where she knew no one and had no way to call for help, even if she regained consciousness, because her communicator had been removed along with all her personal effects. except for the simple medical gown she wore that provided no protection from the cooling night air that would soon blanket the grasslands. Several hours passed and the twin moons of Haven 7 rose above the horizon, casting silver light across the landscape as nocturnal creatures began to emerge from their burrows and the temperature dropped steadily, making the thermal blanket inadequate for someone in Zara's weakened condition, whose body could no longer regulate its own temperature properly due to the illness that had shut down several of her major organ systems. It was purely by chance that anyone found her at all because the nearest town was too far for casual travelers, and the grasslands were mostly empty except for automated farming equipment that followed pre-programmed routes. But on this particular night, a man named Jake Harrison was driving home late from a neighboring settlement where he had been helping a friend repair irrigation systems that had broken down during the recent storms. Jake was in his early 30s with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that he kept short for practical reasons, and he had lived on Haven 7 for 5 years after leaving Earth to escape a past that he preferred not to discuss with anyone who asked, which was rarely because frontier colonists generally respected each other's privacy and understood that many people came to these remote worlds precisely because they wanted to leave something behind. His truck bounced over the uneven ground as he took a shortcut across the grasslands. That would save him 30 minutes of driving time. And he was thinking about the repairs he needed to make to his own equipment the next day when his headlights swept across something that made him slam on the brakes hard enough to make the vehicle skid several meters before coming to a stop. At first he thought it was an animal lying in the grass, perhaps injured or dead, but as he climbed out of the truck and approached cautiously with a flashlight in hand, he realized with shock that it was a person, or at least something humanoid, though the blue-tinted skin and unusual proportions told him immediately that this was not a human colonist, but rather a member of one of the alien species that humans had encountered during their expansion into space. Jake had seen aliens before during his time in the Merchant Navy before he settled on Haven 7, and he recognized Zara as a Valerian, though he had never actually spoken to one of her kind, because they tended to keep to themselves and rarely visited human worlds for reasons that had to do with old territorial disputes and cultural differences that neither side seemed interested in resolving. He knelt beside her and checked for a pulse, finding it weak and erratic beneath skin that was far too cold, and her breathing was shallow enough that he had to watch carefully to see her chest rise and fall at all, which told him that whoever she was and however she had ended up here, she was in serious trouble and would die soon, without immediate help. The logical thing would have been to call the settlement's medical center and let them handle the situation, but Jake hesitated because he knew that colonial bureaucracy moved slowly and there would be questions about jurisdiction and legal responsibility, and by the time all that was sorted out, this woman would likely be dead. So instead, he made a decision that would change both their lives in ways he could not have imagined. He gathered Zara carefully in his arms, noting how light she felt despite being nearly his height, and carried her to his truck, where he laid her across the back seat and covered her with a heavy blanket from his emergency kit, before climbing back behind the wheel and heading not toward the town but toward his own homestead, which was another 20 minutes away across the dark grasslands. Jake's home was a modest structure built from local materials with solar panels on the roof and a greenhouse attached to one side where he grew vegetables year-round to supplement his income from equipment repair work, and it was isolated enough that he could bring an alien woman there without immediately attracting attention from neighbors who might ask uncomfortable questions about where she came from and why she was in such terrible condition. He carried her inside and laid her on his bed in the small room that served as his bedroom, and then spent the next hour doing everything he could think of to stabilize her condition, including raising her body temp, aerature with heating pads, and trying to get some water into her mouth, though she remained unconscious and unresponsive to his efforts, which frustrated him because he had no medical training beyond basic first aid. Over the following days, Jake became both caretaker and student as he tried to understand what was wrong with Zara, using the limited medical resources available on the frontier, including a diagnostic scanner he borrowed from the settlement doctor under the pretense of checking himself for parasites after working in the contaminated irrigation systems, and when the scanner revealed the extent of the damage to her internal organs, he felt a mix of anger and sadness that anyone could have abandoned her in such a state. He researched Valerian physiology using the colony's database and discovered that her species had different nutritional requirements than humans and a higher sensitivity to certain environmental factors, which explained why the thermal blanket alone would not have been enough to save her life if he had not found her when he did, and brought her somewhere warm where she could begin the slow process of recovery. Zara's fever broke on the 6th day, and she opened her eyes for the first time since Jake had found her. And when her violet gaze focused on his face hovering above her, she tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper in a language he did not understand. Though the fear in her eyes was universal, and he quickly backed away to give her space while speaking in a calm tone that he hoped would reassure her despite the language barrier. It took several more days before they could communicate effectively using a translation device that Jake retrieved from the settlement under another invented excuse, and during that time Zara learned that she had been abandoned by her crew and rescued by a human stranger who had no obligation to help her, but had done so anyway for reasons she could not fully understand, because her own people had made it clear that she was not worth saving. Jake explained that he had not reported her presence to the authorities because he suspected there would be complications involving interstellar law and medical quarantine protocols that would separate them and possibly result in her being sent away before she was fully recovered. And Zara realized with growing wonder that this human man was risking his own safety and legal standing to protect her, even though they had never met. Before as weeks passed and Zara's strength slowly returned, she began to help around the homestead doing small tasks at first, like organizing supplies, and later taking over the greenhouse operations, which she managed with impressive efficiency, thanks to her background in xenobiology, which gave her insights into plant cultivation that Jake had never considered. And under her care, the crops flourished, producing yields that exceeded anything he had achieved on his own. They developed a routine that felt comfortable despite their obvious differences, with Jake working on equipment repairs during the day, while Zara managed the greenhouse and prepared meals using a combination of human and synthesized Valerian foods that she had learned to make from the limited ingredients available, and in the evenings they would sit together and talk about their lives before this strange situation had brought them together. Jake learned that Zara had been part of a scientific expedition studying bacterial colonies in extreme environments, and that she had contracted the illness while collecting samples from a cave system on Proxima IV, where the conditions had been deemed safe by their scanners but had turned out to harbor a dangerous pathogen that her immune system could not fight effectively, and her crew had panicked when 2 others died and made the decision to abandon her rather than risk the entire mission. Zara learned that Jake had left Earth after a military career that had ended badly in circumstances he did not detail, but which had left him with scars both physical and emotional that he carried quietly without complaint, and he had chosen Haven 7 because it was remote enough that no one from his past would think to look for him here, and because the work was hard enough to keep his mind occupied and his memories at bay. Something shifted between them during those long conversations, and what had begun as a rescue mission gradually transformed into something neither of them had expected or planned for, but which felt as natural as breathing when they were together. And it started with small gestures like Zara's hand resting briefly on Jake's shoulder when she passed behind his chair, or the way his eyes would follow her movements when she worked in the greenhouse with sunlight filtering through her silver hair. The first kiss happened on a cool evening when they were sitting outside watching the moons rise, and Zara had been talking about her home world and how much she missed the bioluminescent forest where she had grown up playing among trees that glowed in the darkness. And Jake had reached over to wipe away a tear that had escaped down her blue-tinted cheek, and somehow that simple gesture had turned into more when their eyes met and she leaned toward him, closing the distance between them. They both pulled back immediately afterward, with awkward apologies and nervous laughter, because neither was sure if what they felt was real or simply a product of their unusual circumstances where 2 lonely people had been thrown together by chance and desperation. But over the following days, the tension between them grew, until finally, Jake took her hand one morning and asked directly if she felt what he felt, and Zara answered by kissing him again, this time with certainty. Their relationship developed quickly after that breakthrough, and they stopped pretending that what existed between them was merely friendship or convenience. And Zara moved her few belongings from the small guest room into Jake's bedroom, and they began sharing not just space but their lives in a way that felt right, despite all the reasons it should not have worked between a human and a Valerian who came from worlds that barely acknowledged each other's existence. Jake worried sometimes that he was taking advantage of Zara's vulnerable position because she had nowhere else to go and depended on him for survival. But she would remind him firmly that she was a grown woman capable of making her own choices, and that she chose to be with him not out of obligation, but because she loved him, which was the first time either of them had spoken that word aloud, and it hung in the air between them. Like a promise, months passed and Zara's health continued to improve, until she was fully recovered from the illness that had nearly killed her. And Jake taught her to drive the truck and introduced her to a few trusted neighbors as a visiting xenobiologist, who was helping him with agricultural projects, which was close enough to the truth that no one questioned it too deeply, because frontier folk tended to mind their own business unless directly affected by someone else's actions. They talked about the future and what it might hold for them, including the possibility of registering their relationship officially with the colonial authorities, which would grant Zara legal residency status and protect her from any attempts by the Valerian government to reclaim her as one of their citizens who had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. But both of them were reluctant to invite that level of scrutiny into their quiet lives. Everything changed the day Zara woke, feeling nauseous and exhausted, in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the early stages of her illness. And Jake noticed her pale complexion, and immediate worry creased his face as he insisted on scanning her with the medical device, which revealed something that neither of them had considered possible. Given the biological differences between their species, she was pregnant, carrying a child that was genetically both human and Valerian, in a combination that should not have been viable according to everything they knew about xenobiology, but somehow life had found a way. And now they faced a situation that would force them to make decisions they had been avoiding about their future together, and whether they could continue hiding on the frontier, or if they needed to seek help from authorities who might separate them. Jake's first reaction was joy, followed immediately by fear, because he knew nothing about Valerian reproduction, or how a hybrid pregnancy might develop, and whether the colony's medical facilities would be adequate to handle complications if they arose. And Zara shared his concerns, but also felt a fierce protective instinct awakening within her toward the new life growing inside her body. They spent days researching and found almost nothing in the databases about human Valerian hybrids because such unions were extremely rare and usually occurred only in cosmopolitan hub worlds where multiple species mingled freely, unlike the frontier colonies where populations tended to remain homogeneous and conservative in their attitudes toward interspecies relationships. Zara's pregnancy progressed differently than either a human or Valerian pregnancy would have followed, and her body changed in ways that were sometimes alarming, including the development of bioluminescent patterns on her skin that pulsed gently in rhythm with her heartbeat, which Jake found beautiful, but which also marked her as obviously non-human to anyone who saw her, which meant they had to be even more careful about maintaining their privacy. She experienced strange cravings for minerals that were not normally part of either species' diet, and Jake spent hours sourcing unusual supplements from the colony's limited supplies while trying not to draw too much attention to his peculiar shopping habits. And some nights Zara would wake from dreams that felt like memories that were not her own, showing her glimpses of places she had never been, which she thought might be some kind of genetic echo from her unborn child. As her belly grew and the pregnancy became impossible to hide, Jake made the decision to tell a few close friends in the settlement about Zara's true origins and their relationship, and to his relief, most of them reacted with support rather than judgment, though there were a few who expressed concern about the legal and social implications of what they were doing, and warned that they might face trouble when the authorities eventually learned the truth. The hardest part was not knowing what to expect during the birth, because neither human nor Valerian medical protocols seemed entirely applicable to Zara's hybrid pregnancy, and the colony doctor admitted frankly that she had no experience with interspecies births and would be working from first principles if complications arose, which did nothing to ease Jake's anxiety as the due date approached. Zara remained calm through all of this with a serenity that Jake found both admirable and slightly frustrating, because he wanted her to acknowledge the risks they were facing, but she would simply smile in place. his hand on her belly where he could feel their child moving, and tell him that some things were meant to be regardless of what logic or probability suggested. She went into labor on a quiet morning when the grasslands were covered in morning mist, and Jake drove her to the settlement's medical center, where the doctor and 2 nurses had been briefed on the situation and had prepared as best they could for whatever might happen during the delivery, which turned out to be surprisingly smooth, despite everyone's concerns. The baby was born healthy and strong with her mother's violet eyes and silver hair, but her father's human features and skin that shifted between blue and pale pink, depending on her mood and temperature. And when the doctor placed the tiny infant in Zara's arms, both parents wept with relief and joy at the miracle they had created together against all odds. They named her Luna because she had been born under the twin moons of Haven 7, and because both Earth and Valerian cultures had traditions associating moons with new beginnings and hope for the future. And as Jake held his daughter for the first time, he felt something inside him heal that he had not even realized was broken. News of Luna's birth spread through the settlement faster than they had anticipated, and within days they received a visit from a colonial official who informed them that their case had been flagged by the Interstellar Registry System and that representatives from both human and Valerian governments would be arriving within a month to assess the situation and determine the legal status of their family. Jake and Zara spent anxious weeks preparing for those meetings, knowing that the outcome could range from official recognition and protection to forced separation and possibly criminal charges depending on which laws the officials decided to prioritize, and they consulted with a legal advocate who specialized in interspecies affairs and who told them bluntly that they were in uncharted territory. The Valerian delegation arrived first, and Zara faced them with steel in her spine as they questioned her about the circumstances of her abandonment and her subsequent relationship with Jake. And she made it clear that she would not return to Valerian space and had no interest in reconciling with the crew who had left her to die, and that she considered Haven 7 her home now, regardless of what they decided. The human officials were more sympathetic, but equally concerned about the precedent that Jake and Zara's relationship might set for future interspecies unions and the potential complications it could create for colonial governance and immigration policy. But they also recognized that Luna's existence changed everything because she was a citizen of Haven 7 by birth and could not legally be separated from her parents without cause. After extensive deliberations and consultations with legal experts on multiple worlds, a compromise was reached that granted Zara permanent residency on Haven 7 and recognized her marriage to Jake under colonial law, while also establishing Luna as the first officially documented human-Valerian hybrid with full citizenship rights in both human and Valerian territories, which would allow her to choose her own path when she came of age. The decision was hailed by some as a breakthrough in interspecies relations and condemned by others as a dangerous precedent that could lead to the erosion of species-specific cultural identities. But for Jake and Zara, it simply meant they could continue living the life they had built together without fear of separation, and they celebrated quietly with friends who had supported them through the difficult months. Luna grew quickly, displaying remarkable intelligence and abilities that drew from both her genetic heritages, including an intuitive understanding of biological systems that matched her mother's scientific aptitude and a practical resourcefulness that echoed her father's problem-solving skills, and she became a beloved figure in the settlement where children and adults alike were fascinated by her unique appearance and gentle nature. Zara often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point, from being abandoned as too sick to save to finding love and building a family in the most unexpected of circumstances. And she would look at Jake and Luna and feel overwhelming gratitude for the human man who had stopped his truck on a dark night and made the choice to help a dying alien stranger when he had no reason to do so. Jake would catch her gazing at him sometimes with those violet eyes that had first looked at him with fear and confusion and now held nothing but love and trust, and he would pull her close and kiss the top of her silver-haired head and tell her that finding her had been the best accident of his life, and she would laugh and remind him that the universe worked in mysterious ways. Their story became something of a legend on Haven 7, and eventually spread to other worlds as news of successful interspecies relationships always did. In a galaxy where different peoples were still learning to coexist and cooperate despite vast differences, In biology and culture, and young couples from various species would sometimes visit their homestead, seeking advice about their own cross-species relationships. Jake and Zara would welcome them and share their experiences honestly, including the challenges and misunderstandings that had arisen from their different backgrounds, and the extra effort required to build a life together, when even simple things like food preferences and sleep cycles did not align naturally. But they would also emphasize that love could bridge those gaps if both people were willing to put in the work. Years passed, and Luna grew into a remarkable young woman who inherited her parents' best qualities, including her mother's scientific curiosity and her father's steady reliability, and she pursued studies in xenobiology following in Zara's footsteps, but with the unique advantage of understanding both human and Valerian perspectives from personal experience, which made her an invaluable consultant on interspecies medical research projects. Zara never forgot that she had been left for dead by her own people, and that only chance and one man's compassion had saved her life. But she had learned to forgive the crew who abandoned her because holding on to anger would have poisoned the beautiful life she had built. And sometimes she wondered what had become of Commander Vrex and the others, and whether they ever thought about the scientists they had left behind on Haven. 7. Jake still had nightmares occasionally, about the night he found Zara dying in the grasslands and the terrifying days that followed, when he was not sure if she would survive, and he would wake in darkness reaching for her to reassure himself that she was still there beside him, warm and alive, and she would wake too and hold him until the fear passed and morning came. They expanded their homestead over the years, adding more greenhouses and equipment sheds, and eventually building a small laboratory where Zara could continue her research into extremophile bacteria, though now with proper safety protocols and Jake's cautious supervision to ensure she never again risked her life for scientific discovery, and their work gained recognition in academic circles, leading to published papers and even a few awards. Other Valerians heard about Zara's story, and a few reached out to her, including some who expressed shame about how her crew had treated her and wanted to establish better relationships between their species and the human colonies, and gradually a small community of Valerians settled on Haven 7, drawn by the example of successful integration that Zara and Jake represented. The settlement grew and prospered, in part due to the agricultural innovations that Zara had introduced and the improved equipment designs that Jake developed, and they became respected community leaders, though they never sought positions of authority, preferring to influence through example rather than policy, and their home remained a place of warmth and welcome for anyone who needed help. Luna eventually left Haven 7 to pursue advanced studies on the core worlds, but she returned regularly and always spoke of her parents with pride and love that was evident to everyone who heard her tell their story about the alien woman who was abandoned for being too sick to save, and the man who took her in and gave her not just life but a reason to live, and a family that transcended the boundaries of species and culture. In the evenings, Jake and Zara would still sit outside under the twin moons watching the grasslands where their story had begun, and they would hold hands in comfortable silence or talk about their days and their dreams for the future. And sometimes, they would marvel at how a single moment of compassion had changed the trajectory of both their lives, creating ripples that spread far beyond anything they could have imagined. Zara would trace the faint scars on Jake's hands where years of repair work had left their mark, and she would think about all the things those hands had fixed, including her own broken body and shattered spirit when she had nothing left but the will to survive. And Jake would study the bioluminescent patterns on her skin that still pulsed gently with her heartbeat, and think about how beautiful life could be when you opened yourself to unexpected possibilities. They knew their story was unusual and that not everyone approved of their choices, but they also knew that love did not require approval to be real and valid, and that the family they had created was as legitimate and worthy of respect as any other, regardless of what prejudiced individuals might say. And they raised Luna to believe the same, and to never let others' limitations define her own potential. The years brought changes, as they always do, and eventually Jake's hair turned gray and Zara's movements slowed slightly, though Valerians age differently than humans and would likely outlive their partners by decades, which was a reality they both acknowledged, but chose not to dwell on because the present was what mattered, and they made the most of every day they had together. Their grandchildren began arriving when Luna partnered with another hybrid who had been born on a different colony world, and these children represented yet another generation of possibilities, combining genetic material from multiple species in ways that created entirely new expressions of life and intelligence. And Jake and Zara loved them fiercely, while also recognizing that the future belonged to these young ones who would build a galaxy more integrated than anything their grandparents could have imagined. Sometimes visitors would ask Zara if she ever regretted the path her life had taken, and whether she wished she could have returned to her scientific career among her own people instead of settling on a frontier world with a human partner. And she would smile and gesture to everything around her, the homestead and the family and the community they had helped build, and say that she had found something more valuable than any career could have provided. Jake never spoke much about his past on Earth or what had driven him to the frontier, but Zara knew that finding her had given him purpose and healing that he desperately needed, and that in saving her life, he had somehow saved his own, and that their meeting on that dark night had been exactly what both of them needed, even if neither could have known it at the time. The story of their relationship became a case study in xenobiology and interspecies social dynamics, and researchers would occasionally visit to interview them about their experiences and their daughter's unique genetic profile. And they cooperated with these studies because they believed that knowledge should be shared, and that their family's existence proved that the barriers between species were not as insurmountable as many believed. Haven 7 itself changed over the decades, growing from a modest frontier settlement into a thriving colony known for its progressive attitudes toward interspecies cooperation and its strong agricultural economy. And much of that transformation could be traced back to the example set by one human man and one Valerian woman who had chosen to build a life together despite every obstacle. On quiet nights when sleep eluded them, Zara and Jake would sometimes talk about alternate timelines and what might have happened if he had driven a different route that night, or if he had decided to call the authorities instead of taking her to his home. And they would acknowledge that chance had played an enormous role in their happiness, but also that choice had mattered, because he could have left her there, and no one would have blamed him. The important thing was that he had not left her, and that single decision had created everything that followed: the love and the family and the community, and the countless lives touched by their example. And Zara would tell Jake that he was her hero, not because he had saved her life, but because he had given her a life worth living, and Jake would respond that she had done the same for him. As their story spread across the galaxy, it inspired others who were struggling with questions of identity and belonging, and whether it was possible to build connections across the vast gulfs that separated different species and cultures. And the answer that Jake and Zara offered through their lived experience was a resounding yes, though they would always add that it required work and patience and a willingness to see beyond surface differences. They never claimed to have all the answers or to represent some kind of perfect model for interspecies relationships, and they were honest about their struggles and the times they had fought or misunderstood each other because of cultural differences. But they also demonstrated that those challenges could be overcome with communication and commitment, and most importantly with love that was strong enough to weather difficulties. The legacy they built was not just their family, but also the community they helped foster on Haven 7, where multiple species lived and worked together with less friction than in many other settlements, because the precedent had been set early that differences were to be celebrated rather than feared, and that cooperation produced better outcomes than isolation. Luna carried their legacy forward in her own work, developing medical treatments that could be used across species barriers and training a new generation of xenobiologists who understood that life in all its forms deserved respect and care. And she would often credit her parents' example as the foundation of her own philosophy, though she also forged her own path distinct from theirs. Jake and Zara lived to see their grandchildren grown and beginning families of their own, and they watched as the galaxy slowly became more integrated with interspecies, partnerships becoming less rare and less controversial, though prejudice still existed in many quarters and progress was slower than they would have liked. But the direction of change gave them hope. In the end, their story was simple. Despite all its complexities, a dying woman was given a second chance by a stranger who saw her not as alien or other, but as someone in need of help, and from that moment of basic human decency grew something beautiful and lasting that proved love and family could transcend any boundary if people were willing to take the risk. The homestead on Haven 7 remained standing long after its original builders were gone, preserved as a historical site that drew visitors from across the galaxy who wanted to see where it all began. The place where a man named Jake Harrison had brought a Valerian woman named Zara back from the edge of death, and where they had built a family that changed the way people thought about what was possible between different species. Their story became part of the larger narrative of humanity's expansion into space, and the challenges and opportunities that came with encountering other intelligent life. And it served as a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in history began not with grand decisions made by leaders, but with simple acts of kindness, performed by ordinary people who chose compassion over convenience. The grasslands where Jake had found Zara remained largely unchanged over the years, still rolling away toward distant horizons under the light of twin moons, and occasionally someone would stand in that spot and imagine what it must have been like on that night, when two lives intersected by chance and changed the course of countless others through the choices made in the hours and days that followed. Zara had been abandoned, for being too sick to save, deemed not worth the resources required to keep her alive. But Jake had disagreed with that assessment in the most fundamental way possible, by giving her everything she needed to survive, and then choosing to share his life with her, creating something neither of them could have achieved alone. Their daughter Luna would tell the story to her own children and grandchildren, emphasizing the importance of seeing beyond obvious differences and recognizing the common threads that connected all intelligent beings regardless of their appearance or origins, and she would remind them that her very existence proved that life found ways to create connections even when logic suggested it was impossible. The abandoned woman and the man who saved her became symbols of a larger truth about the universe and the beings who inhabited it, that compassion and love were not limited by biology, and that families could be built from the most unlikely materials if people were willing to open their hearts to possibilities they had never imagined. Jake Harrison and Zara lived long lives filled with work and love and the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference not through grand gestures but through daily choices to support each other and build something lasting. And when finally their time came, they left behind a legacy that would continue to influence the galaxy for generations, teaching through example that sometimes the greatest stories began with the simplest acts of human decency.